The Haberdashery closed at noon, a Miss Marple mystery. Chapter 1. The Sign in the Window. The bell above the door of Coyle's haberdashery did not ring at 12:30, and that, in Nettlecombe Priors, was how the world ended. Mrs. Dilys Frobisher noticed first, because Mrs. Frobisher noticed everything. She had come for a card of buttons to finish her nephew's christening gown, and she found the door locked, the blind half drawn, and a square of cardboard hanging crooked in the window. "Back in 5 minutes," it usually said, in Hester Coyle's careful copperplate, whenever she nipped round to the baker's or the bank. This time it said nothing at all. It was simply turned to its blank side, white and empty as a held breath. Mrs. Frobisher rattled the handle. She pressed her nose to the glass and saw the shop exactly as it should be. Bolts of gingham stacked in their pyramid, the wool basket by the till, the brass scales gleaming, except for the small wrong fact that Hester Coyle was not standing behind the counter, and Hester Coyle was always standing behind the counter. In 11 years, Mrs. Frobisher had never once found that shop shut at the noon hour on a market Tuesday. She went for Constable Peach, who was eating a pork pie in the lane, and did not thank her for the interruption. But he came, because in a village the size of Nettlecombe Priors, one learns that Mrs. Frobisher's instincts, however tiresome the woman herself might be, are rarely wrong. They found the back way in, through the yard where Hester kept her washline and her marrows. The door to the storeroom stood ajar, and there, among the bolts of blackout curtain fabric nobody had wanted to buy since 1946, and the crates of ribbon spools, Hester Coyle lay on her side, as though she had simply decided, mid-afternoon of her own shop day, to lie down upon the cold flagstones and never get up again. A cup lay overturned beside her, its contents long soaked into a dark stain between the flags. It smelled, faintly and sweetly, of blackberries. Constable Peach, who was young and had never in his career seen anything worse than a poached pheasant, went the colour of the gingham in the front window and was sick in the yard. By 4 o'clock the news had travelled the length of the High Street twice over, gathering embellishments as it went, the way a snowball gathers snow. By the time it reached the vicarage garden, where Miss Jane Marple was taking tea with the vicar's wife among the last of the Michaelmas daisies, the story had already acquired a knife, though there had been no knife at all. "Poisoned," said Mrs. Verity Ashworth, setting down the teapot with a hand that was not quite steady. "That's what they're saying in the post office. Poor Hester, poisoned in her own storeroom, and nobody heard a thing." "How very dreadful," said Miss Marple, and meant it, though her pale blue eyes had already gone thoughtful in a way that those who knew her well would have recognised, and Verity Ashworth, who had lived in Nettlecombe Priors only 3 years, did not. "They're saying it must have been in something she drank." She kept a bottle of her own cordial in the storeroom, blackberry. She made it every September from the hedges along Cuckoo Lane. Half the village has had a glass of it at one time or another. Verity's hand went, briefly and unconsciously, to the collar of her blouse, as though checking that it was properly fastened. "I had some myself, only last week." "Did you, my dear?" Miss Marple said, in the mild tone of a woman remarking upon the weather. Everyone had. She was generous with it, whatever else one might say about Hester Coyle. Verity's mouth tightened very slightly on the last words, and then, as though she had heard herself, she reached hastily for the plate of seed cake. "More tea, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple accepted, and said nothing further on the subject, though she noted, as she noted most things, in the unhurried, cataloguing way of a woman who had spent 70 years watching a very small world with very great attention, that Verity Ashworth had said whatever else one might say about Hester Coyle in the particular voice of someone choosing not to finish a sentence. The vicar himself, the Reverend Owen Ashworth, came out from his study at 5:30 looking grey about the mouth, and behind him, treading softly as he always did, came the young curate, Mr. Aldous Fenn, carrying a black notebook and an expression of gentle, unremarkable concern that suited his calling perfectly. "Dreadful business," the vicar said. "Dreadful. Poor woman. I shall have to see about the funeral arrangements, I suppose, once they've finished with her." He passed a hand over his face. "Aldous, would you be so good as to call on the family? She had a sister in Market Basing, I believe." "Of course, vicar," said Mr. Fenn, in his soft, unhurried voice. He was perhaps 28, fair-haired, with the sort of face people described afterward as pleasant because they could remember nothing more particular about it. "I'll go directly." Miss Marple watched him go down the garden path, his black coat neat, his stride unremarkable, and thought, though she could not at that moment have said why, that he moved like a man being careful not to be noticed, which was of course precisely how curates were meant to move, so that the thought did not linger. It was Inspector Neal of the County Police who arrived the following morning to take charge of what the coroner would soon confirm was a case of arsenical poisoning. A substantial dose, administered, it appeared, directly into the blackberry cordial Hester Coyle, had been in the habit of pouring herself each day at the close of the morning's trade, before she turned her sign and took her dinner in the little room behind the shop. Except that on the day she died, she had not turned her sign to back in 5 minutes at all. She had turned it to nothing, to blank cardboard, showing to the street a face with no message on it whatever, and that, though nobody remarked upon it for some days, struck Miss Marple as the first genuinely curious thing in the whole sad business. Chapter 2. What the Village Said. By Thursday the village had settled, as villages do, into a comfortable consensus of wrong opinions. At the Green Man, over pints that flowed rather more freely than usual for a Thursday, the talk was of tramps. "A man had been seen on the Basing Road," said Ted Coombs the blacksmith, a rough-looking fellow with a pack on his back, and wasn't it well known that Hester Coyle kept the week's takings in a cash box under the counter until banking day on Fridays? "Robbed and done in for her cash box," Ted pronounced, with the satisfaction of a man who has solved a difficulty entirely to his own liking. "Stands to reason." It did not, in fact, stand to reason, as Constable Peach could have told them, since the cash box had been found exactly where it always sat, its contents, £4, 12 shillings, and a florin with a hole in it that Hester had kept for sentiment, entirely undisturbed. But Constable Peach was not at the Green Man that evening, and the tramp theory flourished unchecked until it reached Miss Marple by way of her gardener, old Hobbs, who repeated it to her over the runner beans with the air of a man delivering settled fact. "A tramp," Miss Marple repeated, snipping a dead head from a rose with more attention than the observation strictly required. "How very convenient that would be, Hobbs. A tramp who knows exactly where the arsenic is kept, and precisely how much blackberry cordial disguises the taste." Before we continue, a quick message for every mystery lover. If you're enjoying this story, you'll love the Baker Street Library, my collection of exclusive detective mystery ebooks available only in ebook format. Download instantly and enjoy your next investigation anytime. You'll find the link in the description, the pinned comment, and the channel description. Now, let's get back to the mystery. And who nonetheless leaves £4.12 in the cash box untouched. I confess I find it a great deal easier to believe in a murderer who knew Hester Coyle rather well. Hobbs, who had known Miss Marple's opinions to prove inconveniently accurate before, said nothing, but went on with rather more care to his beans. At the Women's Institute the following afternoon, where Miss Marple sat making an inventory of the Harvest Supper's jam contributions alongside her old friend Prudence Dunmore, the talk ran to a different, and in Miss Marple's view rather more interesting, channel. "The truth is," said Prudence, lowering her voice though there was no one within 20 feet to hear it, "Hester Coyle knew a very great deal about a very great many people. She had that sort of mind. And that shop of hers, well, one does talk while one is being measured for a hem, or waiting for change. People say things in a haberdasher's they'd never say anywhere else. It's the pins, I always think. Something about being pinned into a garment loosens the tongue. Does it indeed? Said Miss Marple, entirely fascinated by this piece of social observation, which struck her as both original and, upon reflection, quite true. And did Hester ever repeat what she heard, Prudence? Prudence hesitated, and in that hesitation Miss Marple read a good deal. Not repeat exactly. Hester wasn't a gossip, not in the ordinary way. She was too clever for that, and too careful. But there was something about her manner sometimes when she looked at a person, as though she were adding up a sum in her head and had already got the answer and was only waiting to see if you'd worked it out too. Prudence set down her pencil. I don't like to say it of the dead, Jane, but I shouldn't be at all surprised if Hester Coyle knew things that people would very much rather she didn't. No, said Miss Marple slowly. No, I don't suppose you would be surprised at all. Nor, I confess, am I. Inspector Neal, meanwhile, was conducting his inquiries along more conventional lines, and finding them a good deal less satisfactory than a country policeman might hope. Everyone in Nettlecombe Priors had liked Hester Coyle, or said they had, or said it with just enough hesitation to make a careful listener wonder. Everyone had an alibi for the relevant hour, or nearly everyone. And the ones who did not were precisely the sort of ordinary, unremarkable people. A farmer mending a fence alone, an old woman napping in her cottage, whose lack of alibi proved nothing whatever, except that murder does not consider the convenience of the investigating officer. He interviewed Colonel Wickstead first, largely because the colonel had, with a bluster that struck Neal as either entirely innocent or entirely calculated, presented himself at the police house that very morning to explain that yes, he had owed Hester Coyle a considerable account, and yes, she had spoken to him rather sharply about it only the week before, and no, he had not murdered the woman over £11 4 shillings, whatever anyone might be saying, and he'd thank the inspector to remember that a man's word was still worth something in England even now. £11 4 is not a trivial sum, Colonel, Neal observed mildly. It is not, the Colonel agreed, going rather red about the ears. Which is precisely why I intended to pay it, once my pension came through, and why I had no earthly reason to poison the woman who was owed it. Dead women don't forgive debts, Inspector. If anything, I've done myself a disservice. It was, Neal privately conceded, a fair point, and rather too neat a piece of logic for a man supposedly overcome with guilty confusion. He wrote Wickstead, motive weak, manner defensive but consistent in his notebook, and went to call upon the shop's young assistant, a quiet girl named Rosamond Teal, who had worked for Hester Coyle for the better part of 2 years, and who wept steadily throughout the interview without, so far as Neal could determine, actually telling him anything at all. Chapter 3. The Empty Spectacles. It was 3 days after the death, on a grey harvest morning with mist still lying in the hollow by the church, that Miss Marple paid her own quiet call at Coyle's Haberdashery, not, of course, to inquire into anything so indelicate as murder, but merely, as she explained to Constable Peach, who had been left to guard the premises, and who admitted her without much conviction that he ought to refuse, to see whether poor Hester's sister might not want the shop's account books put in order before the solicitors arrived. It was in fact entirely true that Miss Marple had written to the sister offering exactly this service, and equally true that the offer had been made with a secondary purpose so naturally attached to the first that Miss Marple herself would have been mildly offended at any suggestion of subterfuge. The shop, in the flat morning light, had a hushed and waiting quality, as shops do when their proprietor will not return. The bolts of gingham stood in their pyramid, undisturbed. The brass scales gleamed as they always had. Miss Marple went first to the counter, where the till sat closed, and then, moving with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who had spent a lifetime noticing precisely where things ought to be kept, to the small shelf beneath it. There should have been, she knew, for she had been in this shop 100 times, and Hester Coyle was not a woman to change her habits. A pair of steel-rimmed spectacles on a black ribbon, kept always within reach of the till, because Hester's eyes had never been strong for close work, and she would not so much as write a receipt without them. The shelf was empty. Miss Marple stood very still for a moment, her gloved hands folded before her, looking at the small dusty space where the spectacles were not. "Constable," she said, "I wonder whether the police have taken away Miss Coyle's spectacles, along with the other effects from the storeroom." Peach, summoned from his post by the door, looked faintly startled to be asked so precise a question. "Spectacles, Miss Marple? I couldn't say. There was a list made of everything found in the storeroom, of course, but I don't recall spectacles being on it. There was the cup, and the cordial bottle, and her apron, and—" "But not her spectacles," Miss Marple said, "which she would have needed to see the cordial she was pouring, and to read whatever it was she was reading, if she was reading anything, and which are not upon this shelf where they have lived, to my certain knowledge, for the past 6 years." She looked thoughtfully about the shop. "I wonder, Constable, whether you would be so very kind as to look and see if they are anywhere in the storeroom. I shall not touch anything, I promise you." Peach, uneasy but unable to think of a reason to refuse so reasonable a request from so respectable a lady, went to look, and returned some minutes later looking rather more thoughtful than when he had left. "No spectacles, Miss Marple. Not in the storeroom, not in her handbag, not in her coat pocket. I never thought to look for them before, and I don't believe the inspector did either. Why should he? A great many things go missing when a person dies. Nobody thinks anything of it." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "A great many things do go missing, and nobody thinks anything of it, which is very often precisely why a clever person chooses to make them go missing." She was silent a moment, looking again at the small, dusty rectangle on the shelf, where the spectacles' outline could still, very faintly, be traced in the film of dust that had not yet had time to settle evenly. "Tell me, Constable, was the sign in the window quite blank when Mrs. Frobisher found the shop shut? Not turned to back in 5 minutes, as one might expect, but simply blank?" "That's right, blank on both sides where it hung, though the writing's only on the one. Odd little thing to remember, but Mrs. Frobisher did mention it particular, on account of how strange it looked." "Very odd indeed," said Miss Marple, and something in her voice made Constable Peach look at her rather sharply, though he could not for the life of him have said what she had heard in the small blank sign and the small empty shelf that he himself had entirely missed. She walked home along Cuckoo Lane, where the blackberry hedges from which Hester had gathered her fruit each September hung heavy and dark, some berries gone soft and fallen, others still firm and glossy in the pale sun. Miss Marple paused beside them for a long moment, thinking not of blackberries at all but of spectacles, and of signs that ought to say one thing, and said, instead, nothing. A woman does not remove her own spectacles and hide them before drinking a fatal dose of poison, unless she has some particular reason to wish them not found, and a woman does not turn her shop sign to blank, rather than to its customary message, unless something has happened to interrupt her in the very act of turning it, or unless someone else has turned it after her, in haste, not troubling to check which side faced outward. Both possibilities pointed the same direction, though Miss Marple was not yet prepared to say which way that direction lay. She knew only that Hester Coyle had not simply poured herself a fatal glass of her own cordial in the ordinary course of an ordinary Tuesday. Something, or someone, had interrupted the ordinary course of that Tuesday at the precise moment the sign should have been turned, and had left, in its place, only the small, telling blankness of a message never finished. Chapter 4. Secrets Under the Counter. The funeral was held on the Saturday, in a light autumn rain that seemed, Miss Marple thought, entirely suited to the occasion. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but simply grey and steady and faintly cold, the way grief itself so often was in a small English village, worn quietly beneath sensible coats. Nearly the whole of Nettlecombe Priors turned out, for Hester Coyle, whatever her private habits of observation, had been a fixture of the place for 30 years, and a fixture's passing is felt even by those who never much cared for the fixture itself. Miss Marple stood near the back of the churchyard, beneath her good black umbrella, and watched the mourners with the particular attention she brought to any gathering where grief and guilt might, on occasion, be wearing remarkably similar faces. Verity Ashworth stood beside her husband, her gloved hands folded, her face composed into the correct expression of parish sorrow. And yet, Miss Marple noted, her eyes kept sliding, almost against her own will, toward the curate, Mr. Fenn, who stood a little apart, his head bowed, his black coat beaded with rain, the very picture of clerical solemnity. Colonel Wickstead stood near the lych gate, red-faced and uncomfortable in a suit that had plainly been let out at some point in the past decade, and shifted his weight from foot to foot, as though the ground itself made him impatient. Rosamond Teale wept as she had wept, apparently, continuously since the discovery of the body, standing beside her employer's grave with the particular abandon of a very young woman, for whom this was very possibly the first death that had ever touched her closely. And Silas Hargreave, who kept the ironmonger's 2 doors down from the haberdashery, and had been, by every account, Hester Coyle's oldest rival in the small commercial war of the High Street, stood with his hat in his hands and an expression of such perfect, unreadable blankness that Miss Marple found herself, quite involuntarily, wondering what a face worked so very hard to show nothing at all might be working so very hard to conceal. It was afterward, at the subdued gathering in the church hall that village custom required, that Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Dr. Emlyn Voss, the young locum who had taken over old Dr. Fanshaw's practice some 18 months before, and who had been, as it happened, the physician first called to Hester Coyle's body. "A distressing case," Dr. Voss said, accepting a cup of tea from Prudence Dunmore's tray, with the slightly hunted look of a man who has spent the better part of a week fielding questions he is not permitted to answer. "Arsenic is not a pleasant way to go, Miss Marple, whatever the popular fiction may suggest. There would have been considerable suffering, over perhaps 20 minutes to half an hour, before death occurred. She would very likely have known something was badly wrong with her, and been quite unable to reach help in time." "How very dreadful," Miss Marple said, with genuine feeling, for whatever her private investigations into the how and who of a murder, she never lost sight of the fact that a real woman had suffered a real and frightening death, and that this mattered a great deal more than the puzzle it presented. "Tell me, doctor, in your professional opinion, would such a quantity of arsenic have an unpleasant taste, if mixed into a cordial such as blackberry?" "Not especially, no. Arsenic trioxide is very nearly tasteless, particularly in a strongly flavoured drink. Blackberry cordial, being sweet and rather sharp, would disguise it very well indeed. Whoever did this," the doctor added, lowering his voice, "knew that. It wasn't a lucky guess, it was a considered choice." "A considered choice," Miss Marple repeated softly, and looked, without quite seeming to, toward the small cluster of villagers by the tea-urn, where Mr. Fenn was pouring for Mrs. Frobisher, with the neat, unhurried competence of a man thoroughly accustomed to the small domestic rituals of parish life. "Yes, I rather thought it must have been." It was Prudence Dunmore, later that same afternoon, over a fresh pot of tea in Miss Marple's own small sitting-room, who let fall the piece of information that turned Miss Marple's quiet suspicions into something rather closer to certainty of direction, though not yet of destination. "You asked me once whether Hester ever repeated the things she overheard," Prudence said, stirring her tea with more force than the operation required. "I told you she wasn't a gossip. That was true so far as it went. But I've been thinking, since the funeral, of something I saw only a fortnight before she died, and I don't quite know what to make of it, and it's been troubling me rather." "Tell me," said Miss Marple, setting down her own cup with the particular stillness she reserved for moments she judged important. "I'd gone in for wool. I'm making a jumper for my godson, dreadfully behind schedule, and Hester was in the back, and I heard voices, hers and another's, through the curtain to the storeroom. I didn't mean to listen, Jane, you must believe that, but the shop bell hadn't rung to announce me and they simply didn't know I was there." Prudence's hands were quite still now, the tea forgotten. Hester's voice was very cold. She said, "I remember it exactly, because it struck me as such an odd thing to say to anyone. She said, 'I think you had better consider carefully what your bishop would make of it, and what your fiancé's family would make of it, and come back on Friday with a rather more generous answer than the one you've given me today.'" Miss Marple sat very still. "And the other voice, Prudence, did you recognize it?" "That's the trouble," said Prudence Dunmore unhappily. "I've turned it over and over in my mind since the funeral, and I truly cannot say for certain. It was low, and it was quiet, and it said only a very few words before I lost my nerve and slipped out again, before either of them knew I'd heard anything at all. But Jane," she said, "bishop and fiancé. There is only one person in this village to whom both of those words could possibly apply." Chapter 5. The Curate's Ledger. Miss Marple did not sleep well that night, though this had rather less to do with any excitement of the chase than with the plain, sober weight of what Prudence's memory implied. She had known Aldous Fenn in the mild and distant way one knows a curate, a young man who had come to Nettlecombe Priors some 14 months before, from a parish somewhere in the north, with excellent references and a gentle manner that had won him, in short order, the approval of nearly the entire parish council. He was engaged, as everyone knew, to a Miss Prunella Sitwell of Market Basing, a solicitor's daughter of good family, and, by all accounts, a comfortable independent income. The wedding was to be at Easter. It was, villagers agreed, a most suitable match, and one that would set young Mr. Fenn very comfortably indeed upon whatever future living the bishop might see fit to grant him. Bishop, fiancé. Prudence's overheard fragment fitted Aldous Fenn as neatly as a key fits a well-oiled lock, and Miss Marple did not care for how neatly it fitted, because in her long experience, the things that fitted too neatly, too quickly, upon a first inspection, were very often exactly the things a clever murderer had arranged to fit that way. She said as much to Inspector Neal the following morning, having sent a note round to the police house, requesting the pleasure of a few minutes' conversation, a request the inspector, who had, in the course of a long career, learned a healthy respect for elderly ladies whose minds worked in unexpected directions, granted with rather more alacrity than his rank might have suggested was strictly necessary. "You believe the curate had some manner of secret Hester Coyle was holding over him," Neil said, when she had finished. "It's possible, Miss Marple. I won't deny it's possible, but I'll tell you plainly, it's also exactly the sort of thing a village likes to believe about a young clergyman who's a stranger to the place and hasn't yet had time to be forgiven for it. Suspicion falls easiest on the newest face." "That is very true, Inspector, and I have thought of it myself," Miss Marple said, "which is why I should not like you to arrest Mr. Fenn on the strength of one overheard fragment of conversation, however suggestive. I should like instead to know a good deal more about where Mr. Fenn came from, and why, precisely, a young man with such an excellent living ahead of him should have left his previous parish at all." Neil, who privately thought this an eminently sensible suggestion, though he would not have admitted as much to a civilian on first acquaintance, said he would make inquiries, and did so with a promptness that bore out, in the end, Miss Marple's long-held theory that policemen, for all their occasional obtuseness, were very rarely fools. The answer came back within 4 days, by telephone to the vicarage, where Neil had thought it discreet to make his inquiries appear routine rather than pointed. Aldous Fen had indeed served a previous curacy, in a parish some 140 miles to the north, for a period of 2 years, and had left that parish rather abruptly some 18 months before his arrival in Nettlecombe Priors. Not, so far as the records showed, in any public disgrace, but with a note in his file made by his former vicar, that his departure had followed certain irregularities in the parish accounts, which had been resolved privately, without recourse to the police, upon the young curate's agreement to make full restitution and to seek a fresh living elsewhere. Irregularities in the accounts, Neil read aloud, when he brought the news to Miss Marple that afternoon, meaning, when one presses the matter, and I did press it, Miss Marple, I telephoned the vicar himself, a Reverend Pargeter, a very correct old gentleman who plainly did not enjoy being asked, that some 4 years back, a sum of nearly £60 went missing from the parish restoration fund over a period of some months, and was traced, eventually, to young Mr. Fen, who had been handling the collections and had, by his own admission when confronted privately, taken the money to settle certain debts incurred at cards. And it was never made public, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Pargeter didn't want the scandal, and Fen made full restitution. His own mother paid it back for him, apparently, at no small cost to herself, and the whole matter was hushed up between the two of them, on the strict understanding that Fen would take himself off to a fresh parish and conduct himself irreproachably thereafter. Neil closed his notebook, which he has done, by every account, since he arrived here, irreproachably, right up until 3 weeks ago. And if Miss Sitwell's family were to learn of it, Miss Marple said slowly, or the bishop, before Mr. Fenn's ordination to a full living, a young man who took money from a church restoration fund to pay gambling debts is not, I think, a young man the church would be eager to advance, whatever penance he has since performed. And Miss Sitwell's family, I understand, are people of very particular views about respectability. Which gives your curate, Neil said, a motive a good deal stronger than the Colonel's £11 4 shillings. It gives him a motive, certainly, Miss Marple agreed. Whether it gives him the crime is a rather different question, Inspector, and I confess I am not yet entirely satisfied that it does. It was a small, curious detail that gave Miss Marple her first real pause, not in Mr. Fenn's history, which was damning enough on its own account, but in the manner in which she herself had come to learn of that history at all, and in a fact that emerged, almost as an afterthought, from Neil's continuing inquiries among the shop's regular customers. Rosamond Teal questioned again, more gently this time, by a policewoman brought in from the county town, since her tears had proven so unhelpful to Neil's direct approach, had recalled, in a small halting voice, that on the morning of the murder, Hester Coyle had received a letter by the second post, and had read it, standing at the counter, and had gone, immediately upon finishing it, rather white about the mouth, and had said to Rosamond, in a voice the girl had never heard her employer use before, "I believe I shall have a visitor at closing, Rosamond. See that the shop is tidy, and then you may go home a little early. I've something private to attend to." "And did the visitor come?" Neil had asked. "I don't know, sir. I left at 11:30, same as she told me, on account of my mother being poorly. I never saw who came after. The letter itself was never found. Not in the till, not in the storeroom, not among Hester Coyle's personal effects at her cottage on Church Lane. Like the spectacles, it had simply vanished, and Miss Marple, turning this fact over in her mind that evening as she sat with her knitting by the fire, found herself thinking that a murderer, clever enough to remove a letter and a pair of spectacles, and to leave a shop sign turned carefully, deliberately blank rather than risk being seen adjusting it to any particular message, was a murderer very much more careful, very much more collected than the picture of a desperate young man cornered into a single act of panic that the facts, so far, seemed to suggest. Panic did not stop to hide spectacles. Panic did not think, in the terrible seconds after a woman began to die upon the storeroom floor, to reach for a shop sign and turn it, with careful deliberation, to its blank and uninformative side. Whoever had killed Hester Coyle had thought a very great deal, both before the act and after it. And that, Miss Marple reflected, laying down her knitting for a moment to gaze into the fire, was not, on the whole, the mark of a frightened young curate caught in a moment of desperate exposure. It was rather the mark of someone who had planned to kill Hester Coyle for some little while before the fatal Tuesday ever arrived, and had chosen that particular Tuesday because some particular circumstance of it made the killing, at last, both necessary and safe. Chapter 6. A Second Letter. The village had scarcely finished absorbing the rumour of Mr. Fenn's northern disgrace, for rumour it had inevitably become, spreading from the vicarage kitchen to the post office to the Green Man, with the speed and embellishment such things always acquired in Nettlecombe Priors, when a fresh development arrived to complicate matters considerably. It came in the form of a second letter, though this one, unlike the first, did not vanish. It arrived at the police house itself, addressed in a careful, disguised hand to Inspector Neal, and contained a single sheet of plain paper on which someone had written, in block capitals, evidently chosen to defeat any comparison of handwriting, "Ask the vicar's wife what she paid Hester Coyle every quarter day and why." Neal brought this development to Miss Marple with an expression of profound weariness. "Anonymous letters, Miss Marple. I do not care for anonymous letters. In my experience, they are written either by the guilty party, hoping to point suspicion elsewhere, or by some thoroughly malicious soul who enjoys watching other people suffer, and it is very often exceedingly difficult to tell which." "May I see it?" Miss Marple asked, and having examined the block capitals with close attention, added, "It is very carefully done, Inspector. See how the writer has taken pains to vary the size and slant of each letter, so that no natural habit of the hand shows through, that argues someone thoughtful, and rather more educated than the crude phrasing might at first suggest. A truly uneducated, malicious writer does not generally trouble to disguise a hand so carefully. They simply write plainly and rely on the anonymity of the unsigned page. You think it's genuine, then, that Mrs. Ashworth was paying Hester Coyle money?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that we ought to ask her, Inspector, and watch very closely how she answers. For there is a great difference between the reaction of a woman confronted with an accusation that is true, however unwelcome, and one confronted with an accusation that is a complete and startling fabrication. The second sort of woman is generally, I find, a good deal more indignant and a good deal less frightened." Verity Ashworth received Inspector Neal in the vicarage drawing-room, with her husband absent, called away, fortunately or unfortunately, to visit a dying parishioner in the next village, and Miss Marple present at her own particular request, in the character, as she gently put it, of a friend who might make the necessarily difficult conversation a little easier to bear. Neal, who had come by now to value Miss Marple's presence at such interviews, for reasons that had very little to do with comfort and a great deal to do with the elderly lady's uncanny gift for noticing precisely the things witnesses hoped would go unnoticed, had raised no objection. Verity Ashworth went, when the anonymous letter's contents were put to her, precisely the colour of the ash that gave her Christian name so unfortunate an echo, and sat for a long moment with her hands pressed together in her lap before she spoke. "It's true," she said at last, very quietly. I did pay her £5 every quarter day for the better part of 2 years. Her voice cracked slightly. I don't expect either of you to understand what that meant to me, or why I did it, but I will tell you, because I think I would rather tell it myself than have it dragged out of me by degrees. She told it plainly enough, once begun, the story of a young woman, before her marriage to Owen Ashworth, who had loved unwisely and briefly a man who was not free to marry her, in a town some distance from Nettlecombe Priors where nobody now living, she had believed, could possibly connect the respectable vicar's wife of today with the girl she had once, briefly, been. A child had resulted, given quietly for adoption within weeks of its birth, and Verity had believed for the better part of 15 years that this chapter of her life was closed forever, until the day, some 2 years past, when Hester Coyle, visiting as it happened, the very town where it had all occurred, to see a cousin, had by pure and dreadful chance encountered someone who remembered the whole affair, and had returned to Nettlecombe Priors in possession of a secret she had proceeded, with chilling patience, to turn to quarterly profit. She never threatened to tell Owen outright, Verity said, twisting her wedding ring round and round upon her finger. She was too clever for that, too clever to kill the goose, I suppose you might say, though I hate to use such a phrase about a woman who is dead. She simply mentioned, from time to time, how very sad it would be if such a thing came out, how it would affect Owen's position, how a bishop's wife, she always called me that, though I'm not one yet, not really, only Owen has hopes, how a bishop's wife could never survive such a scandal, and I paid her, quarter after quarter, because I could not bear the thought of Owen's face if he learned it, not from me, in some quiet confession of my own choosing, but from Hester Coyle's cold little smile across a counter of ribbon and thread. "And on the day she died, Mrs. Ashworth," Neil asked, gently but without evasion, "where were you, between the hours of 11:30 and 1 o'clock?" "At home," Verity said, "alone. Owen was calling on parishioners, and I was here, in this house, entirely by myself, with no one to say so and confirm it, which I imagine makes me exactly the sort of suspect you are obliged to consider most closely." She looked up, and her eyes, though still frightened, held a kind of exhausted honesty that Miss Marple found, on the whole, rather more convincing than any elaborate protestation of innocence could have done. "I did not kill her, Inspector. I thought about it, God forgive me, I thought about it more than once, lying awake at night wondering how much longer I could bear it. But I did not do it. I hadn't the courage, if I am honest, for anything so decisive. I only had the courage to keep paying and to keep being afraid." Chapter 7. The Ironmonger's Grievance. If Verity Ashworth's confession removed one shadow of suspicion, it did nothing whatever to lighten the general atmosphere of the village, which had by now settled into the particular species of nervous excitement that overtakes a small community when it begins to understand that the person who did the thing is very probably someone they nod to every morning outside the post office. Miss Marple, walking down the high street on the Monday following Verity's confession, found the shops unusually full of customers buying rather less than they lingered to discuss, and the general temperature of feeling running, as it so often did in such cases, toward whichever suspect currently offered the most satisfying shape for public suspicion to take. For the moment, that suspect remained Aldous Fenn, whose gentle manner had done nothing to protect him from a village that had decided, almost overnight, that gentleness, in a young man with a hidden history of theft, was itself a species of cunning. But Miss Marple's own mind ran along a different track, for she had not forgotten Silas Hargreave, the ironmonger, whose blank and carefully composed face at the funeral had struck her as considerably more interesting than the frank distress of nearly everyone else present. She made a point, that same afternoon, of calling in at his shop to purchase a small quantity of picture wire, a purchase entirely genuine, since she had for some weeks been meaning to rehang a watercolour of the vicarage garden that hung crookedly in her hall, and found Mr. Hargreave alone behind his counter, engaged in the melancholy business of totting up a column of figures in a ledger with an expression that suggested the sum was not coming out to his liking. "Trade not what it should be, Mr. Hargreave?" Miss Marple asked, with the innocent sympathy of an elderly customer making conversation. Hargreave looked up, and something flickered behind his eyes before the careful blankness reasserted itself. "Trade's well enough, Miss Marple. A man doesn't get rich selling nails and paraffin in a village this size, but he manages." He measured out her picture wire with rather more attention than the task required, as though grateful for something to occupy his hands. "I suppose you've heard all the talk, same as everyone. Poor Hester. Whatever anyone thought of her, she didn't deserve that." "Whatever anyone thought of her," Miss Marple repeated gently, echoing, though she did not say so, the very phrase Verity Ashworth had used at their first tea together. "You did not care for her particularly, Mr. Hargreave." The ironmonger set down his scissors with rather more force than the wire required. "I won't pretend to a grief I don't feel, Miss Marple. Not to you nor to anyone. Hester Coyle and I had words more than once over the years. She undercut me on wool and thread when the drapers in Market Basing started their price wars, and I undercut her back on buttons and hooks where I could, and it was a proper little trade war between us for the better part of a decade, though neither of us ever came to actual blows over it." A ghost of grim humour crossed his face. "But that's business, not murder. A man doesn't poison his neighbour over the price of buttons." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "I shouldn't have thought so, ordinarily. And yet, Mr. Hargreave, I could not help but notice, at the funeral, that you looked a good deal more troubled than a man merely burying a business rival for 30 years ought to look. I hope you will forgive an old woman's curiosity. I find at my age that I have very little else to occupy my mind besides other people's business, which is, I am told, a shocking failing, though I have never quite managed to overcome it." Hargreave was silent for a long moment, weighing something behind his careful eyes, and then, with the air of a man deciding that concealment had ceased to serve any useful purpose, he set down the wire and spoke. "There was more to it than buttons, Miss Marple, if you must have the truth of it. 3 months back, Hester came to me. Private, mind, not a word to anyone else, or so I believed until this moment, and told me she knew where I'd got the capital, some years back now, to buy this shop outright, rather than lease it as my father had done before me. She'd found out, God knows how, that woman had a positive gift for finding out things, that the money hadn't come from any bank, nor from any legitimate saving, but from a rather less respectable source entirely. A bit of business I did during the war, moving certain goods that oughtn't rightly to have moved, if you take my meaning, when petrol and sugar and a good many other things were rationed rather more strictly than the law allowed for a man's actual needs. Black market goods, Miss Marple said, without a flicker of surprise, for she had suspected something of the sort might lie behind Hargreave's guarded manner from the moment she had first considered him. "Just so. It's 10 years past now, and I've been a law-abiding tradesman every day since. But the law doesn't forget so easily as all that. And neither, it seems, did Hester Coyle. She wanted a share of my profits going forward, a smaller share than she took from some, I'd guess now, having heard what's come out about the vicar's wife, but a share all the same, in exchange for her silence." "And did you pay her, Mr. Hargreave?" "Once," he said heavily. "Once, and then I told her I'd sooner she went to the police herself and let the whole business come out, 10 years old and past prosecuting in any serious way, than go on paying her a penny more, because I'd rather be thought a rogue by the whole village than be bled dry by a woman who enjoyed the bleeding a good deal more than the money itself, if you want my honest opinion of her character. That was a fortnight before she died, Miss Marple, and no, before you ask it, I did not poison her, whatever satisfaction it might have given me to see the back of her blackmailing ways by more conventional means. Miss Marple left the ironmonger's shop with her picture wire and a great deal to think about. For Silas Hargreaves' account, whatever its bearing on his own guilt or innocence, had confirmed something she had begun, over the preceding days, to suspect with increasing certainty, that Hester Coyle's small, careful cruelties had not been confined to any single victim, but had spread, quarter day by quarter day, across a wider circle of the village than anyone, even perhaps Hester herself, had fully appreciated. A blackmailer with only one victim risks a great deal for a comparatively small return, and generally, in Miss Marple's considerable experience of human nature, either grows greedy enough to be caught or frightened enough to stop. A blackmailer with several victims, each paying a modest and bearable sum, each too ashamed and too afraid of exposure to compare notes with the others, could go on very comfortably indeed for years, and could also, of course, considerably widen the circle of persons with sufficient motive to wish her dead. It occurred to Miss Marple, walking home along the high street in the thin autumn sunshine, that she had been thinking about this case rather as one thinks about a jigsaw puzzle with too few edge pieces sorted, assuming, without quite realizing she had assumed it, that the murder must connect somehow directly to the blackmail, when it was equally possible, and perhaps rather more likely given what she now knew of Hester Coyle's methods, that the true shape of the puzzle would only emerge once she had established, with proper thoroughness, exactly how many quarter-day payments Hester Coyle had been collecting, and from whom, and for how long, and, more particularly, which of those payments had recently stopped, or been threatened with stopping, in the days just before her death. For a blackmailer thrives on the steady, bearable payment. It is the payment that suddenly threatens to become unbearable, the demand raised too high, too fast, or the threat of exposure made too immediate, that turns a frightened victim who has managed for months or years to live with quiet shame into someone capable, in a single desperate hour, of murder. Chapter 8. The Second Shock. The village had not yet finished digesting the revelation of Silas Hargreaves' wartime dealings, which emerged, inevitably, within 2 days of Miss Marple's visit to his shop, for Constable Peach was a young man of many virtues, but discretion was not chief among them, when a fresh and considerably more alarming development shattered whatever fragile calm remained. Rosamond Teal was found, on the Wednesday morning, unconscious in her mother's cottage on the edge of the village, having been discovered by that same mother upon returning from an early errand to find her daughter collapsed upon the kitchen floor beside an overturned cup of tea, breathing but unresponsive, her lips faintly tinged with a blue that sent Mrs. Teal running, half in her nightclothes, the full quarter-mile to Dr. Voss's surgery. Dr. Voss, summoned with the urgency the case plainly demanded, worked over the girl for the better part of an hour before pronouncing, with evident and profound relief, that she would live, that the dose, whatever its nature, had been considerably smaller than the one that killed Hester Coyle, whether from the poisoner's miscalculation or the girl's own smaller frame reacting more quickly to a lesser quantity, and that prompt treatment had very probably saved her life. Arsenic again, he told Inspector Neal grimly, once Rosamond had been safely conveyed to the cottage hospital in Market Basing. In the tea, this time, not any cordial. Her mother says she made herself a pot before her mother went out, same as she does every morning, and drank the first cup alone in the kitchen, which means, Inspector, that whoever did this either got into that cottage at some point before this morning and tampered with the tea caddy itself, or someone in that household did it themselves, Neil finished grimly, which I very much doubt, given the girl's own mother is the one who found her, and very nearly out of her mind with fright when she brought her to you. No, Doctor, I think we must assume an outside hand. The The question is why Rosamond Teal, of all the people in this village, should suddenly become worth silencing. It was a question to which Miss Marple, summoned by an anxious note from Prudence Dunmore within the hour, believed she already possessed the beginning of an answer, though she was careful, even now, to hold that answer lightly, as a hypothesis rather than a certainty, until further facts could be gathered to support or overturn it. She saw something, Miss Marple said to Neil that afternoon, in the small parlour of her cottage, where the inspector had come, at her invitation, to compare notes over a pot of Earl Grey that he accepted with rather more gratitude than his official dignity might have wished to admit. Or she knew something, without perhaps fully realising its significance, some small fact about the morning of Hester Coyle's death that she mentioned, quite innocently, to someone in the days since, not understanding that the person she mentioned it to was the very person who had most cause to fear it. "The letter," Neil said slowly. She told the policewoman about the letter Hester received by the second post, the one that made her go white, and send Rosamond home early and expect a visitor at closing. "Precisely, Inspector. And if Rosamond mentioned that letter, or some detail of it, to anyone besides the police, to a friend perhaps in the ordinary course of village gossip, not understanding what she held in her hands, then whoever received that fragment of gossip would have understood, in a single dreadful moment, that the girl might yet recall some further detail, the colour of the envelope perhaps, or a glimpse, however brief, of who called at the shop that afternoon before she herself went home to her poorly mother, a detail dangerous enough to be worth a second, hurried, and rather less carefully calculated murder." "Which brings us back," Neil said, setting down his cup, "to the curate. Fenn's the one person in this village with a motive strong enough for a first murder and a temperament calm enough, by every account, for a second. It brings us back to Mr. Fenn as one possibility among several, Inspector," Miss Marple said, with the particular gentle firmness she reserved for correcting a line of reasoning she judged too hasty. "But I should like you to consider something that has been troubling me rather since Mr. Hargreaves' confession. We now know of 3 persons Hester Coyle was blackmailing: Mrs. Ashworth, Mr. Hargreave, and, if Prudence's overheard conversation is to be trusted, Mr. Fenn himself. 2 of those 3 have given us, when directly confronted, an account of themselves that strikes me, on careful reflection, as considerably more consistent with innocence than guilt. Mrs. Ashworth wept, and confessed a great deal more than the letter alone required her to confess, which is not, in my experience, the behaviour of a practised murderess protecting herself. Mr. Hargreave confessed to a very serious past crime, rather than allow suspicion of murder to stand unchallenged, which argues a man who values his present reputation enough to fight for it honestly, however dishonestly he once behaved." "And Fenn?" "Mr. Fenn," said Miss Marple slowly, "has said remarkably little of anything at all, Inspector, throughout this entire business, and I find myself wondering whether that is because he has, in fact, the least to hide of the 3, and has simply had the good sense to say nothing until directly asked, or whether it is because he has in fact the most to hide, and has had the considerable presence of mind to say nothing that might give it away. I do not yet know which, but I think it is high time we asked him directly, and watched, very closely indeed, how he answers." Chapter 9. What the curate said Aldous Fenn received Inspector Neil and Miss Marple in the small, sparsely furnished room he occupied at the vicarage, with a composure that Miss Marple found, upon close observation, rather more remarkable than the young man himself perhaps intended it to appear. "I know why you've come," he said before Neil had properly begun. "The whole village knows about my past by now. I don't imagine there's a soul in Nettlecombe Priors who hasn't heard the story of the Parish Restoration Fund, however garbled it's grown in the telling. I won't insult either of you by pretending surprise. Then perhaps you'll save us all a great deal of time, Mr. Fenn," Neil said, by telling us plainly whether Hester Coyle knew of that history and whether she made any use of it. Fenn was silent for a moment, his hands folded neatly upon his knee, his fair head bowed in an attitude that might equally have signified prayer or calculation. She knew, he said at last. I don't know how. I never told her myself, God knows, and I'd hoped when I came here that the whole miserable business was buried deep enough in the past to stay buried. But she knew, and she came to me, very quietly, very reasonably, about 3 weeks before she died, and told me that she thought it only right her silence should be worth something to a man about to marry, into a family as particular about respectability as the Sitwells. And what did she ask of you, precisely? Miss Marple asked, her voice mild, her attention absolute. Money, to begin with, not a large sum, by her own account, only what she called a token of good faith, £2 a quarter, she suggested, which I could ill afford on a curate's stipend, but might, I suppose, have scraped together. But it was not only money she wanted, in the end, and that was the part I found hardest to bear. Fenn's composure slipped, very briefly, into something rawer. She wanted small favours, information. She asked me, more than once, to mention to her. Quite casually, she said, nothing that need trouble my conscience. Small confidences I heard in the course of parish visiting. Who was in debt? Whose marriage was unhappy? Whose son had got into trouble at school and hushed it up? I refused her, Inspector. I want that clearly understood. Whatever I did 4 years ago, I have not spent the past 18 months betraying the confidences of my own parishioners to satisfy a blackmailer's curiosity, and I told her so, in this very room, not 10 days before she died. That must have angered her considerably, Neil observed. It did. She told me I had better reconsider, and reconsider quickly, because she had no particular reason to keep my secret for nothing if I would give her nothing in return, and that a letter to the bishop or to Prunella's father would cost her a stamp and very little else. Fenn's jaw tightened. I will not pretend to you that I was not afraid, Inspector. I was very afraid indeed, but I did not kill her. I spent that Tuesday afternoon, the whole of it, from 11:30 until well past 3, visiting 3 separate families in the outlying cottages on the Basing Road, a round of pastoral calls the vicar himself had asked me to make, and each of those 3 families will confirm, I should think, precisely when I arrived and when I left. Neil made a careful note of the names Fenn supplied, and Miss Marple, watching the young man's face throughout this recitation, found herself struck by something she had not quite expected to find. Not the smooth, rehearsed calm of a man reciting a prepared alibi, but the halting, occasionally stumbling honesty of someone who plainly found the whole confession a genuine and considerable relief, as though a weight he had carried alone for some weeks had finally, however painfully, been set down. There is one thing further, Fenn said, as they rose to leave, which I ought perhaps to have mentioned sooner, though I did not think of its significance until this very conversation. On the day she died, I did not see Hester Coyle that day, Inspector. I want that plainly understood. But I did see, from the vicarage window, at perhaps 12:15, someone standing rather a long while outside the haberdashery, in the covered way opposite, as though waiting for the shop to open again, or perhaps working up the nerve to go in. I did not think anything of it at the time. I have thought of very little else since. And who was it, Mr. Fenn? Miss Marple asked very quietly. I couldn't be entirely certain, Miss Marple. The covered way is shadowed, and I saw only a figure, not a face, and I was engaged, at that moment, in packing my bag for the afternoon's calls, and did not linger at the window. But the figure wore a hat I believe I recognized, and a coat of a particular cut, and if I am not very much mistaken, though I would not wish to swear to it before a court of law, I believe it was Dr. Voss. Chapter 10. A Doctor's Discretion. Dr. Emmeline Voss was not, upon reflection, a name that had figured largely in Miss Marple's earlier calculations, and she found herself, walking back from the vicarage in the last light of the afternoon, obliged to reconsider the whole shape of the case with a candour she rather admired in herself, even as she regretted the necessity for it. He was a young man, not more than 3 or 4 and 30, who had come to Nettlecombe Priors some 18 months before to take up old Dr. Fanshaw's practice, while that gentleman recovered, with a slowness that had by now stretched well past any reasonable expectation, from a serious illness of his own. He was well liked, competent, and, as Miss Marple had occasion, over the following 2 days, to observe with rather closer attention than she had previously troubled to bring to him, a man about whom remarkably little of a personal nature was actually known in the village, for all his professional visibility. It was Prudence Dunmore, once again, who supplied the thread Miss Marple had been looking for, though neither woman recognised its full significance until considerably later. "Dr. Voss came to us on Dr. Fanshaw's recommendation," Prudence said, over their now customary afternoon tea, "though I did hear, from Mrs. Frobisher of all people, that there was some small difficulty about his previous position. Nothing serious, I'm sure. Only a disagreement with a hospital board somewhere. The sort of thing that happens to ambitious young men who don't suffer fools gladly. He wants Fanshaw's practice permanently, you know, once the old man finally retires, which everyone assumes he must do before too very long. It would be a very good position for him, a settled country practice with an excellent list of patients." "And has anything happened, Prudence, to threaten that prospect?" Miss Marple asked. "Not that I've heard, though now you mention it, there was some talk, a month or so back, about a complaint. A patient's family, unhappy about some treatment or other, wrote to the medical board, I believe, though nothing came of it in the end. Dr. Fanshawe smoothed it over, being still nominally in charge of the practice, and it was all forgotten within a fortnight." Prudence frowned, remembering. "Though I did hear, and this is only gossip, Jane, I want to be clear, I've no idea whether there's a word of truth in it, that the complaint concerned a prescription Dr. Voss wrote, and some question of whether he'd examined the patient properly before writing it, or whether he'd been persuaded to write it as a kindness to a friend, rather than upon proper medical grounds." Miss Marple set down her teacup with particular care. "A prescription written as a kindness to a friend," she repeated slowly, "is a very interesting phrase, Prudence, and I wonder whether Hester Coyle, who appears to have possessed an extraordinary talent for discovering precisely the sort of thing people most wished kept hidden, might not have discovered a good deal more about the particulars of that complaint than the medical board itself ever managed to establish." Inspector Neale, when Miss Marple laid this new line of thought before him, received it with the weary patience of a man who had begun to suspect the whole village might, upon sufficiently thorough investigation, turn out to be concealing something from Hester Coyle's ledger of secrets. "I'll question him," he said, "though I'll tell you frankly, Miss Marple, I'm not certain we're any further forward than we were a week ago. We've now got 4 persons with reason to fear what Hester Coyle knew about them, and precious little to distinguish which of the 4, if any, actually poisoned her, and a second attempt, on the Teal girl, that could as easily have been made by any one of them, given none of the 4 has an alibi that will bear the very closest examination." "That is not quite true of all 4, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently. "Mrs. Ashworth, by her own admission, was alone, which proves nothing either way, but at least does not actively contradict guilt or innocence. Mr. Hargreaves' whereabouts on the relevant afternoon I have not yet inquired into with proper thoroughness, though I intend to remedy that. Mr. Fenn has given us 3 families on the Basing Road, who can, I should think, confirm his movements rather precisely, which is either the alibi of an innocent man or a very carefully arranged one, and I confess I have not yet decided which." "And Dr. Voss," she paused, "Dr. Voss, Inspector, is the one person among the four whose movements on that Tuesday afternoon we have not yet properly examined at all, and I think it high time that oversight was corrected. Dr. Voss, questioned that same evening at his surgery, proved considerably less forthcoming than either Verity Ashworth or Silas Hargreave had been, though whether this reflected greater guilt or merely a professional habit of discretion, built over years of guarding patients' confidences, Miss Marple found herself, even after the interview concluded, genuinely unable to determine. I did know Hester Coyle knew something of a professional matter I would rather have kept private, he admitted at last, when Neil's patient and methodical questioning had exhausted every avenue of evasion available to him. I won't deny it, since I imagine you'll uncover the particulars soon enough regardless of what I say. There was a complaint some weeks back concerning a prescription I wrote for a patient, a friend, if you must have the whole of it, a man I'd known before I ever came to this village, who asked me for something to ease a difficulty he was ashamed to have properly examined, and I wrote it without the full examination the regulations strictly require, because I judged at the time that a friend's private embarrassment mattered more than a formality I believed, in that particular case, entirely unnecessary. It was a misjudgment, I've regretted it since, but it was resolved, quietly, by the medical board, and I had believed the matter closed. Until Hester Coyle discovered it, Neil said. Until Hester Coyle discovered it, yes, and made it plain to me, some 3 weeks ago, that she considered the particulars of my patient's private difficulty, a matter that, I promise you, Inspector, has no bearing whatever on this case, and which I will not discuss further. Patient confidentiality being a professional obligation, I take a great deal more seriously than my critics might suppose, worth a regular payment to ensure her continued silence. I refused her. I told her plainly that if she wished to write to the medical board herself, she was welcome to do so, and that I would rather face a second inquiry, however unwelcome, than allow myself to be bled for money by a shopkeeper with a talent for other people's secrets. And were you, Doctor, standing outside the Haberdashery on the afternoon Hester Coyle died, at approximately 12:15, in the covered way opposite the shop? Dr. Voss's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the earlier part of the interview, faltered very briefly. I was, he admitted. I had gone to speak to her again, to make one final attempt at persuading her to abandon the whole scheme, before matters went any further. But the shop was shut when I arrived, the sign already turned, and I assumed she had simply gone to her dinner early, and I went away again, without ever going in. I did not see her that day, Inspector. I did not speak with her, and I certainly did not poison her cordial, which I would remind you I had no opportunity whatever to do, since I never crossed her threshold. The sign was already turned, Miss Marple repeated softly, at 12:15. That is a very interesting detail, Doctor, and I thank you for it tells us, I think, rather more than you perhaps intended it to. Chapter 11. The Hour Reconstructed. That evening, Miss Marple sat a long while by her own fire with a sheet of paper and a pencil, doing something she rarely troubled to commit to writing, but which she found, in this particular tangle of overlapping motives and half-glimpsed figures, had become genuinely necessary, constructing, as carefully as the available facts allowed, a proper timetable of the fatal Tuesday. Rosamond Teal had left the shop, by her own account, at 11:30, sent home early by an employer visibly shaken by the morning's second post. Sometime between 11:30 and Hester's death, which Dr. Voss's own post-mortem examination had placed, with reasonable confidence, at somewhere between noon and 12:30, given the state of digestion and the swiftness with which so substantial a dose of arsenic would have acted upon her, the shop sign had been turned. Not to back in 5 minutes, which was the message Hester herself would surely have chosen had she turned it in the ordinary way before stepping into the storeroom to await her expected visitor, but to blank cardboard, showing nothing at all to the street. and Dr. Voss, arriving at what he claimed was 12:15, had found the sign already turned, and had gone away again without entering. Miss Marple considered this fact for a very long time, turning it over in her mind as she might turn a small, oddly shaped stone found in a garden bed, uncertain at first what use it might serve, but confident that its very strangeness argued some purpose she had not yet grasped. If Dr. Voss's account was true, then the sign had been turned, and, in all likelihood, Hester Coyle already dead or dying upon her storeroom floor, some time before 12:15. This considerably narrowed the window in which the murderer must have acted, not at the leisurely close of the day's trade, as the original theory of a poisoned cordial, consumed at Hester's habitual closing hour, had assumed, but hurriedly, in the very heart of what should have been the shop's busiest hour, immediately, or very nearly immediately, after Rosamond Teale's early departure. This meant, Miss Marple realised with a small, cold clarity, that Hester Coyle's visitor, whoever had come in response to the vanished letter, whoever she had told Rosamond to expect at closing, had in fact come very much earlier than closing, taking advantage of the girl's unexpected absence to call at once, rather than waiting for the appointed hour at all. And it meant that whoever had poisoned the cordial had done so with remarkable speed and remarkable presence of mind, pouring the fatal dose, watching or waiting through the brief and terrible minutes of its effect, and then, before fleeing the scene, pausing to remove both a letter and a pair of spectacles, and to turn the shop's sign to a blank and unreadable face, all within a window of perhaps 20 or 30 minutes. It was not, Miss Marple thought, the behaviour of a person acting upon sudden impulse. Impulse does not pause to consider spectacles. It was the behaviour of someone who had come to that shop already prepared, with the poison already procured, already concealed upon their person, or already secretly introduced into the cordial bottle at some earlier opportunity, and who had planned, with cold and careful deliberation, precisely how to remove every trace of their visit once the deed was accomplished. This inclined her, more strongly than before, toward the theory that the poison had not been added to the cordial at all during that fatal quarter hour, but considerably earlier, perhaps days earlier, by someone who had access to the bottle in the ordinary course of shop business, and who had then simply waited, with a patience that struck Miss Marple as genuinely chilling to contemplate, for Hester Coyle to pour herself a glass at some moment of the murderer's own choosing or convenience, secure in the knowledge that when the fatal dose was finally consumed, they themselves might be nowhere near the shop at all, and entirely unable to control or predict the exact hour of death. Except that the letter complicated this tidier theory considerably. If the poison had been introduced days before, why the letter that same morning, and why Hester's evident agitation and her instruction to Rosamond to expect a visitor at closing, unless the letter and the poisoning were not, after all, the work of the same hand, unless someone had written to Hester Coyle that morning for some entirely separate purpose, and the poison, already patiently waiting in the cordial bottle since some earlier day, had simply happened to take its fatal effect that same unlucky Tuesday, a grim coincidence of timing that had nothing whatever to do with the letter's contents at all. Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment, considering this possibility, and found that it did not entirely satisfy her either, for coincidences of that particular convenience were, in her long experience, considerably rarer in real village life than in the pages of a detective novel, and she was disinclined to accept one without a great deal more evidence than she currently possessed. There was, she thought, one further possibility she had not yet properly examined, that the letter itself had been the poisoner's own device, not a genuine communication from some outside party at all, but a message written by the murderer, and somehow conveyed to Hester Coyle by the second post that very morning, specifically designed to draw her, alone and unsuspecting, into the storeroom at a particular hour on some pretext plausible enough that Hester herself had believed it worth sending her assistant home early to accommodate. If that was so, then the letter's disappearance was no mere tidying of loose ends, but the deliberate removal of the one piece of physical evidence that might, had it survived, have revealed the murderer's hand directly. For a person clever enough to disguise a demand for blackmail money in careful block capitals would very possibly be clever enough to disguise, or forge, whatever pretext had lured Hester Coyle to her death. Chapter 12. Rosamond remembers Rosamond Teal, recovering slowly in the cottage hospital at Market Basing, received Miss Marple's visit, undertaken the following morning, with a small basket of hothouse grapes and Inspector Neil's rather reluctant blessing, with the wan gratitude of a young woman who had spent the past several days considerably more frightened than she had yet found the words to express to anyone official. "I keep thinking, Miss Marple," she said, propped against her pillows, her face still pale beneath its fading bruise of illness, "that it must have been something I said, something I told someone, without ever meaning any harm by it, that made whoever did this think I knew more than I really do. But I've turned it over and over in my mind, and I can't for the life of me think what it could have been." "Take your time, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself into the chair beside the bed with the particular patience she had cultivated over a lifetime of listening to frightened people find their way, slowly and by uncertain paths, toward memories they did not yet know they possessed. "Tell me again about that morning. Every small thing you can recall, however unimportant it seemed at the time. Sometimes the memory that matters most is the one we have dismissed as trivial." Rosamond closed her eyes, concentrating. The post came at its usual time, 10:30 or thereabouts. "There were 3 letters that day. I remember because it was more than usual. Miss Coyle didn't get a great deal of post as a rule. 2 were bills, I think, or looked like bills, the ordinary brown sort. The 3rd was different, white, and rather good quality paper. I noticed that much because it wasn't the sort of envelope tradesmen generally use." "Can you recall anything of the hand that addressed it?" "I didn't look closely, Miss Marple. I was busy with a customer at the time, and only glanced at the post as Miss Coyle sorted it at the counter. But I do remember—" Rosamond's brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. "I do remember that she opened the white one first, out of the 3, as though she recognized something about it even before she'd broken the seal. And her face changed the moment she'd read perhaps 2 lines of it. I'd never seen her go so pale. And after she had read it, did she say anything at all before her instruction to you about going home early?" "She said—" Rosamond hesitated. "She said something odd, Miss Marple, that I didn't understand at the time and haven't thought of since, not until this very moment. She said, 'So it's to be blackmail both ways, is it? Very well. 2 can play that particular game.'" Miss Marple went very still. "Blackmail both ways," she repeated softly. "Are you quite certain of those words, Rosamond?" "Quite certain, Miss Marple. It struck me as such an odd thing to say. I remember wondering afterward whether I'd misheard, but I don't think I did. She said it almost to herself, not really to me at all. And then she told me to tidy the shop and go home, on account of Mother being poorly, and that she'd have a visitor at closing and something private to attend to." "Rosamond," Miss Marple said, very carefully, "I want you to think very hard and tell me only what you are genuinely certain of, and nothing that you have simply come to believe because others have suggested it to you. Did Miss Coyle, in the days or weeks before her death, ever receive a letter or make a remark that suggested to you someone was attempting to blackmail her, to threaten her with some exposure of her own, rather than the other way about?" The girl's eyes widened. "Now that you say it, Miss Marple, there was something, a little while back, perhaps a month before she died. A man came into the shop one afternoon, not a customer, or not one I recognized in any case, and he and Miss Coyle went into the storeroom together and spoke for some minutes, quite low, and when he left, He looked angrier than I'd ever seen anyone look, and Miss Coyle looked shaken too, which wasn't like her at all. She was never a woman easily shaken, not by anything I ever saw. Can you describe this man, Rosamond? Anything at all? His age, his dress, the manner of his speech? He was not a young man, Miss Marple. Older, I should think, than my own father, though not old the way you might mean old. Well-dressed, in a good coat, the sort a gentleman from Market Basing might wear, rather than anyone from our own village. I'd never seen him before that day, and I never saw him again, though I did wonder about him once or twice afterward, without ever quite working up the courage to ask Miss Coyle who he was. Miss Marple sat for a long moment in silence, the pieces of a very different picture beginning, very slowly, to assemble themselves in her mind. A picture in which Hester Coyle was not merely the patient spider at the centre of her own web of small village secrets, but herself, perhaps, entangled in some larger and more dangerous thread that reached beyond Nettlecombe Priors entirely. To a well-dressed stranger from Market Basing, whose anger, on that unremembered afternoon a month before her death, had been fierce enough for a 14-year-old shop girl to remember it still, weeks later, in a hospital bed she had very nearly not lived to occupy. "You have been extremely helpful, my dear," she said at last, rising to take her leave. "More helpful, I think, than you yet realize. I want you to rest now, and to say nothing of this conversation to anyone but Inspector Neal, should he come to ask you further questions. And I want you to know that you are, at this very moment, under the particular protection of a policeman stationed outside this very ward, so that you need fear no further mischief while you recover. Whoever did this to you, Rosamond, has very good reason now to fear that you remember a great deal more than they ever intended you should." Chapter 13. The Man from Market Basing. The well-dressed stranger proved, in the end, a good deal easier to trace than Miss Marple had feared, for Hester Coyle's sister in Market Basing, a Mrs. Ivy Prentice, recalled the name at once when Inspector Neal called upon her to settle the small remaining business of her sister's estate. "That would be Mr. Ambrose Weald, the solicitor," Mrs. Prentice said, dabbing at her eyes with a black-bordered handkerchief. "Hester had some money in a small building venture he managed, years back, 3 cottages on the Basing Road, meant to bring in a steady little income for her old age, poor thing. There was a dispute over the accounts. Some months back, Hester was convinced he'd been shorting her on the rents, and she went at him hammer and tongs about it, by all accounts. He came to the shop that once to try and settle it quietly, and it turned into a proper row, from what she told me after." "And was the matter ever resolved, Mrs. Prentice?" "It was, as it happens, not a fortnight before she died. Mr. Weald sent a cheque, a rather handsome one, to make good the shortfall, along with a letter of apology. Hester showed me the letter herself, quite pleased with how the whole business had turned out. Blackmail both ways was her own little joke about it, Inspector, if that's the phrase you're asking after. She meant that she'd out-blackmailed the man who'd tried to swindle her, by threatening to report him to the Law Society unless he made proper restitution. She had rather a taste for that kind of victory, my sister. It was, I'm sorry to say, very much in her nature." Neal confirmed, within the day, that Mr. Ambrose Weald had indeed spent the whole of the fatal Tuesday in Market Basing itself, engaged in unimpeachable business at his own office with 3 separate clients who could vouch for his presence hour by hour, and the thread of the angry stranger, which had promised for a brief while to open some new and darker chapter of the case, closed itself as neatly and as disappointingly as it had opened. "A dead end," Neal said to Miss Marple that evening, with the particular weariness of a policeman who has spent 2 days' careful labour arriving precisely nowhere. "It happens in every case, I suppose. Threads that look promising and lead only back to the same small circle we started with." "Not entirely a dead end, Inspector," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "It tells us a good deal about Hester Coyle's character that I think we should not too quickly set aside, that she was a woman who met threat with threat, and pressure with counter-pressure, rather than fear. A woman of that temperament, faced with a blackmail victim who had finally found the courage to refuse her, as we know both Mr. Hargreave and Mr. Fenn refused her, in their different ways, would very likely have responded not with any thought of retreat, but with an escalation, a sharper letter, a firmer deadline, precisely the sort of pressure that might turn a frightened man's fear into something considerably more desperate. She paused, and drew from her work-basket the small notebook in which she had, over the preceding days, been keeping her own careful record of every interview, every small discrepancy, every remembered fragment of testimony that had passed before her attentive eyes and ears. "I wonder, Inspector, whether I might trouble you to read back to me your notes of our conversation with Mr. Fenn, the whole of it, from the very beginning, exactly as he gave it." Neil, somewhat puzzled but long past questioning Miss Marple's requests, obliged, reading through his careful shorthand transcript in a steady, unhurried voice, while Miss Marple listened with her eyes half closed, her hands quite still in her lap, until he reached the passage concerning the figure glimpsed from the vicarage window. "There," she said softly, "read that portion again if you would, Inspector. The exact words, as nearly as your notes preserve them." Neil read, "I did see, from the vicarage window, at perhaps 12:15, someone standing rather a long while outside the haberdashery. I was engaged, at that moment, in packing my bag for the afternoon's calls, and did not linger at the window." "Packing his bag for the afternoon's calls," Miss Marple repeated, very quietly, "at 12:15. "And yet, Inspector," Mr. Fenn told us, not 5 minutes earlier in that very same conversation, that he had spent the whole of that Tuesday afternoon, his own words were, I believe, the whole of it, from 11:30 until well past 3, visiting 3 families upon the Basing Road. If he was still at the vicarage packing his bag at 12:15, he cannot also have been already out upon his round of pastoral calls since 11:30. The two statements cannot both be true, Inspector, and I confess I did not notice the discrepancy myself until this very moment, hearing them read back to back, one directly after the other, without the space of several minutes' conversation to blur the joins between them. Inspector Neil sat very still, staring down at his own notebook, as though it had somehow betrayed him. "A discrepancy of 3/4 of an hour," he said slowly, "which would place him at the vicarage, not upon the Basing Road at all, at very nearly the precise hour Dr. Voss places the poisoning, and give him, Miss Marple, considerably more opportunity than he has led us to believe he possessed." "It would indeed, Inspector. And a man clever enough to plan a murder with such careful attention to the removal of spectacles and the turning of a blank sign is, I think, very likely clever enough to have constructed a plausible alibi for the hours that mattered most, and careless enough, perhaps, being only human after all, to let slip one small, contradicting detail in the telling of it, because he could not resist the temptation of directing our suspicion toward Dr. Voss instead, and did not pause to consider how that detail, once examined closely, would instead direct it back toward himself. Chapter 14. The Harvest Supper. The Nettlecombe Priors' Harvest Supper, held that year in the church hall on the last Friday of September, went forward despite the shadow that lay across the village. For country custom does not easily bend to grief, and the vicar himself had judged, after some private consultation with his wife, that the small comforts of ordinary life were owed to a parish that had suffered a very great deal of fright in a very short space of time. Miss Marple attended, as she attended every such gathering, with her knitting bag and her mild, observant smile, and took her seat at a long trestle table beside Prudence Dunmore, from which vantage point she could observe, without appearing to observe, very nearly the whole of the hall, Colonel Wickstead holding forth to Mrs. Frobisher about the excellence of the year's marrows, Silas Hargreaves standing rather apart, near the door, still wearing something of his earlier composed blankness, though the worst of the village's suspicion had by now, following the revelations of the preceding fortnight, largely passed him by. Verity and Owen Ashworth seated together, her hand resting very lightly upon his sleeve, in the particular manner of a couple who have weathered something difficult and come through it, if not unscathed, then at least still standing together. Dr. Voss arrived late from an urgent call, taking his seat with the slightly harried look of a man whose profession rarely permitted him a full evening's peace, and Aldous Fenn moving among the tables with a plate of scones, pouring tea for the elderly, and infirm with the same neat, unhurried competence Miss Marple had observed in him from the very first evening of this whole sad business, his manner as gentle and as unremarkable as it had ever been. It was Inspector Neale, present in his official capacity though seated, by design, at some distance from Miss Marple, who had agreed, after a good deal of careful discussion between them that afternoon, to the small experiment Miss Marple now proposed to conduct. Not a formal accusation, for they possessed as yet no more than a suggestive contradiction in timing, insufficient upon its own to secure a conviction, but a quiet test of the kind Miss Marple had, over a long career of unofficial detection, found very often more revealing than any direct interrogation. She waited until the tea had been poured and the plates cleared, until the hall had settled into the comfortable murmur of a village at ease with itself, and then, in a voice pitched to carry only a little further than the immediate circle of the table, she began to speak, ostensibly to Prudence, though her true audience sat 2 tables distant, gathering up empty cups with his usual gentle diligence. "You know, Prudence," she said, "I have been thinking a great deal these past days about poor Hester's spectacles. It has struck me as such a very curious thing that they should have gone missing entirely, when everything else in that shop was found exactly where it ought to have been. I said as much to Inspector Neale only this afternoon, that whoever removed them must have done so for a very particular reason, because they knew, you see, that Hester's spectacles would have shown a mark, or a smudge, or some small trace of exactly what she had been reading in her final moments. A letter, perhaps, held very close to failing eyes, in the last minutes before the poison took its full effect. One does not think to hide spectacles unless one has thought a very great deal, in advance, about precisely what small physical traces a murder might leave behind, and unless one has had time, in that terrible quarter-hour of waiting and watching, to think of such details at all. Prudence, following the thread of this conversation without any particular suspicion of its purpose, nodded and made some sympathetic reply, but Miss Marple was not, in truth, attending to her friend's answer at all. Her pale eyes, mild and unhurried as ever, had moved, very briefly, to the figure of Aldous Fenn, some yards distant, and had observed, in the fraction of a second before he mastered himself, and continued gathering the cups with exactly the same neat, unhurried motion as before, a stillness pass over him, a single arrested moment in which his hand, reaching for a cup, had paused very slightly in the air, as a man's hand pauses when he has heard, quite unexpectedly, his own careful secret, spoken aloud by someone who was never meant to have discovered it at all. It was the smallest of things, a hand stilled for perhaps half a second, over a teacup, in a crowded hall full of ordinary harvest chatter. Miss Marple doubted very much that Inspector Neale, watching from his more distant table, had seen it at all. But she herself had seen it, and had watched, over a lifetime of quiet observation, for exactly such small betrayals of the calm surface a guilty conscience works so very hard to maintain, and she knew, with the particular cold certainty that came to her only rarely, and only when she was very sure indeed, that she had at last found the person she had been looking for. Chapter 15. The Truth in the Hall. Miss Marple did not act at once upon what she had seen. For a single stilled hand, however telling to her own long-trained eye, was not evidence upon which any inspector could properly act, and she had no wish to see an accusation founder for want of the plain, corroborating fact that would make it stand before a court of law. But she rose a little later in the evening and made her way, with the unhurried casualness of an old lady seeking a second cup of tea, to the small table near the urn, where Aldous Fenn stood alone. "A very pleasant evening, Mr. Fenn," she said mildly, "though I confess I have found my thoughts returning, all evening, to poor Hester, and to a small puzzle that has been troubling me rather. I wonder whether you might help me resolve it, since you have such a good memory for the small details of that dreadful Tuesday." "I'll help however I can, Miss Marple," Fenn said, and his voice, she noted, was very nearly as steady as it had ever been. Very nearly, but not quite. "It concerns the hour at which you first saw Dr. Voss outside the haberdashery. You told the inspector it was 12:15, and that you were, at that moment, packing your bag before setting out upon your round of pastoral calls. And yet you told us also that you had spent the whole of that afternoon, from 11:30, upon those very calls. I have puzzled over it a good deal, Mr. Fenn, and I cannot make the two accounts agree with one another, however I turn them. I wonder whether you might explain it to me." She watched him very closely as she spoke, and saw the small, controlled stillness pass over his face once more. Not panic, not yet, for he was a young man of considerable composure, and had, she suspected, rehearsed some version of this very conversation many times over in the privacy of his own troubled mind, since the moment he had let the detail slip. But beneath the composure, something had begun, very quietly, to give way. "I must have misremembered the time," he said. "One does, in the confusion of such a dreadful week. The exact hours blur rather, looking back." "That is very possible, Mr. Fenn," Miss Marple agreed gently, "and I should be entirely willing to believe it, were it not for one further small fact that has been troubling me. Rosamond Teal, who is recovering very well, I am glad to say, and whose memory has proved a good deal more reliable than anyone gave her credit for, recalls quite clearly that Hester Coyle received 3 letters that fatal morning, 2 ordinary bills, and one upon good white paper, addressed in a hand that made her go pale the moment she began to read it. That letter has never been found, Mr. Fenn, nor have Hester's spectacles, which she would certainly have worn to read so important a communication. Both vanished from that shop within the same short window of time in which, by your own account, you were still at the vicarage, some quarter-mile distant, packing your bag. I don't see what any of that has to do with me, Fenn said, and his voice had gone very quiet now, very careful, the voice of a man choosing each word with the particular deliberation of someone walking upon ice he has only just realized is thinner than he believed. "Perhaps nothing at all," Miss Marple said, "except that Hester Coyle told you, not 10 days before she died, that a letter to your bishop would cost her a stamp and very little else. And a woman who makes such a threat and is then refused what she asks is not, in my experience, a woman who lets the matter rest quietly. I think she wrote to you again, Mr. Fenn, that very Tuesday morning, with her demand sharpened and her deadline shortened, and I think you went to her, not at closing, as she had told Rosamond to expect, but very much earlier, the moment you learned, by whatever means, that the shop girl had already gone home and left her employer alone. This is fantasy, Miss Marple, Fenn said, but his hand, she noted, had closed very tightly around the cup he held, the knuckles gone white against the china. It was Inspector Neale, drawn by some signal Miss Marple had not consciously given, but which he had, over the preceding fortnight, learned to watch for, who arrived at her side in that moment, with Constable Peach a discreet pace behind him, and the small knot of village conversation nearby began, very gradually, to quiet, as those closest to the tea-urn became aware that something of considerable importance was unfolding in their midst. "Mr. Fenn," Neil said, quietly but with an authority that carried, nonetheless, across the hushing hall, "I wonder if you would care to explain to me again, in rather more careful detail than you managed on our last conversation, precisely where you were, between 11:30 and 12:30, on the Tuesday Hester Coyle died. And I should tell you plainly, before you answer, that we have this afternoon confirmed with the Basing Road families that your first call that day was not made until well past 1 o'clock, a full hour and a half after the time you originally gave us." The hall had gone entirely silent now, every face turned toward the small tableau by the tea-urn, and it was in that silence, with every eye of the village he had served for 14 months fixed upon him, that Aldous Fenn's carefully maintained composure finally, and completely, broke. "She would have destroyed me," he said, and his voice, when it came, was scarcely more than a whisper, though it carried, in the hush of that hall, to every corner. "Not for money. I could have found the money somehow, scraped it together. But she didn't want money in the end, not really. She wanted to own me. She said if I refused her again, she would write to the bishop that very week, and to Prunella's father besides, and that I should lose everything, the living, the marriage, every good thing I had built since that one wretched mistake 4 years ago that I have spent every day since trying to make right." He set down the cup at last, very carefully, as though even now some habit of gentleness would not entirely desert him. "I went to reason with her. I swear to you, Miss Marple, I went only to reason with her, one final time, before she could send that letter. But she laughed at me. She stood there in her own storeroom and laughed, and said I was a fool to think 14 months of good behaviour could outweigh what I'd done, and I—" His voice broke entirely. The cordial was there, on the shelf. I don't know, even now, quite how the thought came to me, except that I had thought of it before, in the darkest hours of the night, and never believed I would actually. I only meant to frighten her, at first. I told myself that, even as I did it, that I would only frighten her, and she would understand, at last, that I would not be pushed any further. "And Rosamond Teal," Miss Marple said gently, into the silence that followed, "whom you visited, I think, in the guise of pastoral comfort, once you learned she had begun to remember the letter. She let it slip, quite innocently, when I called on her, that she remembered the colour of the envelope, the good white paper, and that she'd been turning it over in her mind, wondering if she oughtn't to tell the police about it after all. I could not risk what she might yet recall." Fenn's face was wet now, though he seemed scarcely aware of it. "I have prayed every night since Hester died, Miss Marple, for some kind of forgiveness I know now I have no right whatever to ask for. I am more sorry than I can say. It will not bring either of them back, but I am more sorry than I have words to tell you." There was nothing more to be said, in the end, that mattered a great deal beside that final, broken confession, and Inspector Neil, with a quiet economy that spared the young man whatever small dignity remained to him, took him gently by the arm and led him out of the hushed and horrified hall, past the harvest decorations and the abandoned plates of scones, into the cold, clear night where Constable Peach's car stood waiting. Chapter 16. What Remained. The village took a long while to settle, in the weeks that followed, into whatever new and quieter shape it would eventually assume around the absence of both Hester Coyle and the curate who had, for 14 months, seemed to everyone the very picture of gentle, unremarkable goodness. There is always, after such a revelation, a kind of grief distinct from grief for the dead, a mourning for the ordinary trust a small community extends, almost without thinking, to those who move quietly and kindly among them, and the slow, uneasy work of learning to extend that trust again. Verity and Owen Ashworth remained in the parish, their marriage, by all outward appearance, drawn closer rather than shattered by the trial it had weathered. For Owen, when the full truth of his wife's long and secret payments finally reached him, had gone to her not with anger, but with a tenderness that surprised even Verity herself, and told her, as she later confided to Miss Marple over a rather tearful cup of tea, that whatever she had done 15 years before a frightened girl, she had done nothing since but love him faithfully, and that this, in the end, was the only accounting that mattered to him. Silas Hargreaves' confession of his wartime dealings caused, in the end, a rather smaller stir than he had feared. For 10 years is a long while in a village's memory, and most of Nettlecombe Priors, upon reflection, found they preferred their ironmonger's honest nails and paraffin to any lingering resentment over sins so distant and so thoroughly repented. Dr. Voss, for his part, weathered his own small scandal with the philosophical resignation of a man who had, in the end, been guilty of nothing worse than an excess of loyalty to an old friend, and settled, in time, into precisely the comfortable country practice he had hoped for, old Dr. Fanshawe having finally announced his retirement that Christmas. Rosamond Teal recovered fully, and left Nettlecombe Priors the following spring to take up a position in market basing. At a distance, her mother confided to Miss Marple that the girl herself had judged necessary for the peace of her own mind, though she wrote every fortnight cheerful letters full of news that suggested the shadow of that terrible autumn was fading, slowly but surely, into ordinary memory. Miss Marple herself, walking home along Cuckoo Lane one grey November afternoon, past the blackberry hedges now bare and thorny with the season's turn, found her thoughts returning, as they so often did in the quiet aftermath of such a case, not to the puzzle of it, which had, after all, resolved itself as such puzzles generally did, through nothing more mysterious than patient attention to the small and ordinary details that frightened, guilty people so often let slip in the telling of an otherwise careful lie, but to the sadder truth beneath it. Aldous Fenn had not been, at the bottom of things, a wicked man. He had been a frightened one, who had once made a foolish mistake as a very young man, and spent 4 years trying honestly to outrun it, only to find that a single act of desperate self-protection, taken in a moment he had believed unbearable, had made him something very much worse than the thief he had once briefly been. It was, Miss Marple reflected, very often the way of it, that murder was so rarely committed by the monstrous or the wicked in any grand sense, and so very often by the ordinary, the frightened, the fundamentally decent person pushed, by pressure applied steadily enough and cruelly enough, past the point where decency could hold. Hester Coyle, too, had not been wicked in any simple sense, only a clever, watchful woman whose gift for noticing what others wished hidden had curdled, somewhere along the way, into a taste for the small, cold power such knowledge gave her over her neighbours, until that same gift had finally cornered someone with a great deal more to lose and a great deal less capacity to bear the losing than she had ever troubled herself to imagine. There was no great moral to be drawn from it, Miss Marple thought, beyond the one she had learned and relearned so many times over so many years of quiet village life, that human nature, examined closely and without sentiment, was neither so good nor so bad as people generally supposed, but was, in the end, dreadfully, endlessly capable of both, and that the gentlest face in any room was very often hiding nothing more sinister than an ordinary sorrow, and very occasionally hiding something a great deal worse, and that only careful, patient attention, offered without judgment and without haste, could ever reliably tell the one from the other. She reached her own gate as the last light faded from the lane, and let herself into the warmth of her small sitting-room, where the fire was laid and her knitting waited exactly where she had left it, and thought, with the particular quiet satisfaction of a woman who had done, once again, what small good she could in an imperfect world, that there was nothing more to be done tonight but to sit by the fire and knit and be glad, in a modest and unremarkable way, that the truth, however sad, however sordid, however painful to every person it had touched, had at last and properly been told.